This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs. The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Now, here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. One Wednesday last August, passengers disembarked from the first direct commercial flight from the U.S. to Cuba since 1961. The 51-minute flight was the culmination of years of efforts on the part of the Obama administration to normalize relations with the island after nearly 6 decades of tension. Since that historic flight touched down last summer, Fidel Castro has died, Raul Castro has announced his retirement in early 2018, and Donald Trump has become president. Will these changes chill the recent thaw in U.S.-Cuban relations, or have the two governments indeed, in the words of President Obama, buried the last remnant of the Cold War in the Americas? For a ground-level update on the state of U.S.-Cuban relations, we're joined once again by Michael Martin, adjunct professor in the Department of Urban Planning and lecturer at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at UWM. Following his first trip to Havana in 2003, he's returned on numerous occasions to lead university study abroad programs, including a trip earlier this month. Michael, welcome back to International Focus.
Good to see you, Doug.
Well, the question I'm dying to ask is, a year later, with all of these changes, what looked different?
Everything and nothing. What is pretty amazing right now is the level of access that Cubans have to the internet. It is exponentially increased, and the ability to use handheld iPhones and Samsung cell phones has gone up. Hotspot Wi-Fi is everywhere, and instead of having neon around hotels now, you have Cubans and tourists with the glow of the cell phone.
So, is this paid access? I mean, are there sort of hourly rates, or are there hotspots that are just available to everybody?
Well, there are hotspots available all over the island. There's thousands of them, apparently. But around a lot of the tourist hotels, there's a lot of black market activity, selling of passwords and whatnot. But it has really become the way that Cubans are accessing the internet. It's we're all accustomed to having a cable come into our home and being able to have a workstation or a laptop, but really public Wi-Fi is the way that the internet is accessed by most Cubans.
And, a lot, as you said in the introduction, has changed since then. Let's start with the death of Fidel. I mean, that was not all that long ago before your trip. So are there still sort of aspects of the official mourning process going on? Or?
Oh, I think that is one of the more interesting things about Cuba right now is Fidel's legacy is huge. Those who are very tied to the government, especially those that I met who work for universities and things like that, paid lots of reverence. And there were lots of mournful words about our great past leader and things like that. But the youth are quite ambivalent. He has not been president for almost 10 years. His status is legendary, but is really much more of a relic of the past. And I think Cubans are really ready to move on. And
we've had the announcement subsequent to that of Raul's retirement. Now, first of all, do people believe it? Do you think the date in, I think it's February of 2018 he mentioned, is that going to stick?
Yeah, things move slow on the island, and there's a Cuban phrase that President Obama used and others use, which is no es fácil. Nothing is easy in Cuba, and I can imagine that when the time comes, Raul will make that decision. Politically, I think the things that people are really concerned about is the power vacuum of when, now that both of the Castros would be gone, who is really going to step up and maintain power? For so long, anyone who was opposed to the regime was repressed, and it has really kept any political alternative from rearing up on the island. And it's a great unknown about who really will take power. Lots of people have theories, but as we can see, I don't think anyone really has a crystal ball when it comes to Cuba.
Well, and in many of situations where you had a revolutionary government, there's a cachet with that generation of people that I think can't be passed on, isn't there? I mean,
oh, absolutely. And it is rather ironic. The Cuban Revolution happened in 1959, and it was a very youthful revolution. Most of the people were in their 20s and 30s, and now most of the people are in their 70s and 80s. And that generation has maintained power and held it very closely. And it's been almost 2 generations that it's been. So again, the future is very murky as it relates to what happens next.
Well, one of the other big changes was driven by this warming of relations. The Obama administration ended what was colloquially known as the wet foot, dry foot policy. First of all, explain a little bit what that was and what the impact of it being rolled back might be.
Sure. I think you have to go back many, many years. The Cuban Readjustment Act of '66 set forth the ability for Cubans to immigrate to the United States outside of the system. And there were lots of ways that a Cuban could actually get their citizenship without going through actual immigration channels. With the special period in the fall of the Soviet Union and the mass exodus of people on the island, our government in the 90s was forced to kind of deal with the fact that there were a whole lot of folks that were risking their lives floating across the Straits of Florida to try to get here. And we established a policy called wet foot, dry foot, which was essentially that if you were caught in U.S. waters, and you were a Cuban national, that you were sent back to Cuba. But if you made it to dry land, you were able to start the immigration process. For the vast majority of us, it was a policy that really never made sense in the first place and was situational at best, trying to deal with a immigration flow coming from the island across the Straits of Florida. And so its demise is really the conversations that I had with Cubans were really about the folks that were in transit. The immigration flow from Cuba to the United States is no longer one across the water so much, but it was more of the land bridge of folks going to South America, places like Ecuador and Bolivia and Mexico and Central America, and taking transportation up through Mexico to try to get to the United States. And there's a real concern about what the change in policy will do with those people who are in limbo.
So talk a little bit about that. I mean, how does that impact Mexico, for example?
Well, I think that there could be a potential of people that have some sort of immigration limbo status that Mexicans may not be dealing with. Because this is, quote unquote, an illegal immigration flow, it's really hard to know what the numbers would be. But it's something that is, again, not always well thought out. We in the United States tend to look at our policies towards Cuba as a one-way street. We've had an embargo. We've dealt with many things towards Cuba, but Cuba also has opinions about the United States, and their policies are often geared towards maintaining their own self-interest. So between the two, we often get policies that don't make sense, and the Mexicans could be bearing the brunt of some of that.
Well, talk a little bit about the previous policy as it impacted people who did make it in. They were allowed to make 2 trips annually back to Cuba, right? And one of the criticisms in this country by sort of longer-term Cuban emigres was, these are formerly refugees, and they're making these essentially holiday making twice a year, taking their families back to Cuba and spending their American dollars in nice resorts. So there's probably a divide of opinion within the Cuban-American community regarding the policy, wasn't there?
Oh, yeah. In general, it was just a policy that didn't make sense and was for a time and a place in the 90s. And it's fraught with problems. And the ability to go back and have a special status that was different from Haitians or was different from Dominicans or was different from many people in Central America caused a lot of animosity. And the Cuban-American community, I believe, was right in pointing out some of those flaws, that the putting up of folks leaving a communist regime has no longer the political cachet it used to. And so I believe that's why it really was left behind.
So let's turn back to the situation you found on your trip. Talk a little bit about the currency situation right now in Cuba.
Well, what most folks don't know is that Cuba is probably one of the only countries on the earth that has two forms of currency. There is a national peso, which most Cubans are paid in, and the Cuban economy runs in, and then there is the equivalency peso, which is really one-to-one to the dollar, and is meant to ensure that there is foreign currency coming into the country from tourists. And so the ability to understand the two-tiered economy is really about understanding the nature of how a regular Cuban lives and how Cubans live that participate in the tourist economy.
Right. So, for example, if you're paid on the local currency, you'll have one salary, and if you're, for example, a cab driver who interacts with tourists who are using that alternative currency, you're likely to have a very different income.
Oh, absolutely. As somebody who appreciates education, the idea of a college professor or a doctor making less than a musician or a cab driver is, I'm a big supporter of the arts, but it's fraught with social problems. And the more and more that the tourist economy runs Havana, it seems like it's going back to more of a 1950s situation that the revolution really fought against. And the Cuban government is in a no-win situation. I don't think that if they still had a benefactor that could help them out, that the tourist industry would be supported the way it is, but it is economic survival for them. And for many of the Cuban people, it is amazing how much wealth is coming into the city of Havana. My guess is from Cuban Americans who are investing into tourist infrastructures such as bed and breakfasts and restaurants that now are legally being able to be held by Cubans and has got a very interesting entrepreneurial spirit about it.
So talk a little bit about that. I mean, how much of an indigenous tourist industry is there now? I mean, is it mostly mom and pop who can convert their spare room in the house to a little B&B, or is it something else?
Well, I heard a phrase once that Havana is like a bee dipped in amber, and that it's still, that caught in time aspect, and that really is dealt with in the same situation in terms of the tourist infrastructure. So there have been very few hotels built. There is one big one being built on the nicest piece of real estate in Havana, right on the Malecon. But other than that, most of the hotel business that is starting up and is new is the rehabilitation of old hotels. And so the tourist economy and the tourist infrastructure is really maxed out. So the ability to let B&Bs flourish and people letting out rooms in their house is really kind of a safety valve or a stopgap for being able to do this. And it is charging very low rates for an American tourist standard, but is really a lot of money for the average Cuban and is really adding to wealth inequality, because anyone who can participate in the CUC, the equivalency peso economy, is doing quite well, and those that aren't doing so well. Inflation is taking hold, And prices are going up. The rations that Cubans get for basic essentials and food is lessening. And if you're not part of the tourist economy, the belts are tightening on the island.
So, if we set aside, for example, or for the moment, the embargo, which, distorts U.S. investment on the island, are nationals from other parts of the world able to participate in this at all? Or is it strictly sort of Cuban investment, such as it is in the indigenous tourist industry?
Well, there is foreign investment in Cuba. The hotels, there's a number of Spanish investors. What people have to realize that the non-corporate model that Cuba has, any investments that are substantial investments in the tourist economy or in any other type of manufacturing economy must be owned 51% by the Cuban government. There's not a lot of corporate entities that are willing to take that level of risk or that level of lack of control. So the embargo, the rest of the world can invest in Cuba, but there hasn't been a lot. And average businessmen, even with the opening up of the internet and with some of the infrastructure improvements that happen, is still very difficult for the average business to conduct business.
Well, we mentioned the passing one way and another of the Castro brothers. The other big story in the intervening years between your visit was, of course, the election of Donald Trump. Now, what was the perception among people you talked to about that?
It was amazing. People wanted to engage on the subject, and they wanted very curiously to know why our country elected Donald Trump. I don't think the animosity towards Trump is quite as high in Cuba as it would be a place like Mexico, where there were actual policy implications for his election. I think there was just a general curiosity of this guy who is a larger-than-life figure, who is on TV, that people know him as the apprentice, and how could he be our president? It was an intellectual curiosity.
So there was no sense of what this may mean. I mean, taking a step back, what was the perception of the Obama administration on its way out? I mean, he had his famous trip to Havana and a speech that was, by all accounts, fairly well received. So what did people think about the outgoing administration?
Well, Obama is loved on the island, and there's no two ways about that. I think that the message of hope that he ran on in 2008 and 2012 is exactly why Cubans loved him, because he offered an economic lifeline. Cubans, rightfully or wrongfully, have been told that all of their problems have been based on the U.S. embargo, and any shred of hope that that embargo and that United States investment or United States money could flow on the island was loved. And I think just generally the idea of having some respect and recognition for Cuba was loved by the Cuban people. And so I'm a big fan of baseball, and the ability to talk baseball and to talk Obama and Raul sitting in the Estadio Latinoamericano, watching the national team play the Tampa Bay Rays, was made for great political baseball diplomacy, but it also just made for good feelings on the island. It's one thing that the United States and Cuba share is baseball, and that's something that just struck a chord with Cubans.
So, is there any sense that that source of hope would in any way be impacted by the American election, or is it just a question of curiosity because this reality TV figure is now the president?
Well, to know Cubans and to talk politics is to know that there is not a lot of straightforward political conversation among Cubans. To talk about Fidel Castro usually isn't done with words, but with facial expressions of the bearded one and references that only a Cuban would get. So it's very hard to talk straight politics with Cubans because they're just not used to it. And I think the wait-and-see attitude of what's going to happen with Trump. Obviously, here's a gentleman who invests in hotels, and the tourist industry is one of the biggest success stories with Cuba right now. And so Perhaps there are deeper conversations to be had. I just didn't have them. Most of them were just straight up political curiosity.
And, as your reading of the new administration, as early on as it is, obviously, what's your sense of where they're likely to come down on Cuban issues?
Well, I think that it's going to be a low priority, to be honest. I think the status of Florida in the Electoral College has always been one that has been a 600-pound gorilla as it relates to Cuba and upsetting the Cuban-American apple cart. And most polls that I've seen have seen that almost all Americans are in favor of more normalized relationships with Cuba. So I think it's going to be more internal Republican politics. There are many Southern senators who tend to be very conservative, but are whose states are very tied to the business community. Arkansas has Tyson Chicken, and Tyson Chicken is one of the largest presences of U.S. business on the island. And Louisiana grows a lot of rice that is imported by Cuba. And Jeff Flake, who's the senator of Arizona, has gone on record saying that a pro-business approach would be good. So my hope is that calmer heads prevail and that we come out with some sort of rational way of dealing with it. My sense has always been that human rights issues are an issue in Cuba and do need to be dealt with, but in the big picture, we lost a war with Vietnam, who was a communist country, and we have free trade with them now. It seems rather ironic that this standard for Cuba is still what we have.
So, you've taken 2 trips a year apart, and, we've talked a little bit about some of the differences you've seen. What trends would you see continuing going forward in all of this, and what may change?
Well, I really think that the tourist economy is the key to where the changes are right now, and that there is a great hunger on the island for information. One of my favorite little stories that I had was sitting on the porch of a hotel in Pinar del Rio, a small city inland, and talking old baseball with a younger guy who literally had a cell phone and would look up on Google the names of the guys that I would ask him about, and was very proud to be able to say that he could deal with that. And it is that interaction with tourists and interaction with the tourist economy which offers in some sort of economic hope. The utopian nature of the revolution is long since faded, I believe, and that the economic realities of trying to feed your children, trying to have a decent life, are going to tie people to the tourist economy. And I think what people in Cuba are scared about is that the egalitarian nature of being able to have free education and free health care all may be in jeopardy as things change, and crime may become an issue. Here's a city of 2.5 million in the Caribbean. Most cities of 2.5 million in the Caribbean, like Kingston, like Santo Domingo, are very, very dangerous places. And Havana's a relatively safe place. So there's both hope and fear with any big change.
Well, and it sounds like the current bifurcated currency structure and benefits accruing to those with access to the tourist industry is creating a certain stratification.
Oh, absolutely.
Are people sensitive to that in terms of what their alternative could be? I mean, it's like, why do I have to be in the tourist trade if I want to make a go of it?
Cubans are very educated people. In general, you'll never see a place that has such a third world economy and such a first world education system. And I think there is a lot of animosity with people who are doing what they believe is socially good. They are very supportive of the regime, or at least they're supportive of the ideals of the regime. And knowing that somebody who drives a cab or cooks a meal is making 3, 4, 5, 10 times what they make is bound to have some sort of social implications. I don't think there's a model or any other place that we could look for to see this play out in a way it's Cuba's first.
Well, we've got just about a minute left, so what do you think comes next? I mean, when Raul departs the scene, is there a soft landing?
I don't think there is. Everything moves slow in Cuba. No es fácil. And as things move forward, I think that the Cuban government is going to slowly but surely make changes. But there's nothing fast that's going to happen. There's going to be no opening up. There's no perestroika. There's going to be no Russian-type revolution that happens without bloodshed. We have this relationship with Cuba that goes back so many decades that's tied to tourism that you can't see it ebbing at all. And if there is an opportunity to do it and make money, I'm sure the Cuban government will find a way to do it.
Well, Michael Martin, thank you for that, and we'll look forward to your next update next year.
Excellent. Excellent. I hope to be able to give it.
To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs.